For a long time, as we were talking about globalism, the president talked about interrelationships. I was talking about devolution of power because the very structure of interrelationship was asymmetric. And it was an example where if you had the EU and the EU had one printing press for 26 or 30 countries, it would not work. England understood this. England understood that the sterling, the pound, could never be attached to the EU because the EU wasn't determined by France or Germany. It was determined by a bureaucratic Brussels, which was totally ineffective. It totally is failing because England is breaking out, Spain. Well, because what I look at is the initial structures of institutions and where they are fragile. And when I began to see, when I was in France, I grew up in France, part of my life. When I was in France in the 80s and the Maastricht Agreement was made, I understood very quickly that if you're going to change French francs or German Deutschmarks for the euro, you already failed. Why? Because Germany was so powerful that the Deutschmark was in fact determining the outcome of the entire trade organization in Europe. And I don't think Obama understood this, Bush Jr. never understood it. Our intelligence community could understand part of it, but they couldn't understand the speed at which we had devolution of power. The same thing in Washington. Even though Trump has come to Washington, he's really staying in his own place, and that makes sense. And he has broken with the entire system. When everybody said, as if it was a joke, that he was Twittering, no, he explained it very well. In the 21st century, if you do not use Twitter, you fail. Well, in a way, Alex, with all due respect, I don't see them as enemies because they're not that strong. They're not that formidable. When they see you, Alex Jones, as an enemy, that's formidable. I mean, what you have done over 14 years makes it formidable. And remember, it was a voice, and it was the internet that you used and created. And you were able to syndicate. They don't want to, you got to understand, when it hurts, they don't want to admit it. There's a dynamic called denial, and it's not a river in Egypt. They want to deny what happened to them. How can you explain, if you're Hillary and Bill Clinton or Chelsea, how you spend $1 billion?
That was my next question. She really thought she would win. We confirmed with our sources. She threw fits, attacked people, had to be sedated.
Correct.
So how was she so delusional?
Well, when you live in a bubble, and this is what we were talking about for decades, you and I, she lived in the bubble where she never had to do anything on her own, never drove her car, never had to go see a doctor who was a real doctor who could diagnose her Parkinsonism, and she was always protected by the Secret Service. But I want to thank certain members of the Secret Service who revealed to us that she had these diseases. Even if she got into the White House, which I didn't think she would make, she could never remain as president of the United States. It just wouldn't happen. I can't go into the reasons why, but she understood it. Unfortunately, Bill Clinton and the Democrats never understood what I was saying months before and almost a year before there. Do not run. It wasn't an issue of my threatening them. It was a warning to them. You cannot run. You are not viable as an entity. I don't know who was going to run against her at that time, but we knew very well within the system she could not be accepted within our system. Alex, what's happening is where you're growing, with all due respect, they're basically having a cash flow problems. Even the New York Times had a little article 3 or 4 days ago, a small article saying how their cash flows have diminished because none of the advertisers are going to go to the New York Times. Well, they're basically bankrupt. What you have here is you have an entity which is basically bankrupt, but they don't want to declare the bankruptcy. You have a Mexican drug lord that's been funding them on the cash flows. You don't need reporters anymore. You don't need an editor. All of that is nonsense. What has happened, thanks to Infowars and Breitbart and others, and what we've done, it was to take away the newspapers, to take away their content, and basically realign it with the 21st century. What do I mean by that? The internet and social media was so powerful that you knew how to use it, Breitbart knew how to use it, Bannon knew how to use it, and most importantly, Trump knew how to use it. He was brilliant. He absolutely understood the power of the social media and the Twitter. Now, I studied that in 1973 at MIT when I was taught by DARPA, the internet and social media. You and I have talked about it, where your father was involved in it. But in 1973, before Zuckerberg or Gates came out and self-aggrandized themselves, we were already talking about the impact of the social media on the world. And that was funded by DARPA and the CIA in its heyday. Now, you see 50 years later, Trump literally using it. And the Democrats had no idea. They didn't even use it at all. And what did they do? They went exactly the old road. Because they're ignorant. They were ignorant, self-delusional, and arrogant. When you have that tripod and you have that triad, it's a very deadly combination. It's basically self-destructive. You and I have talked about that. You and I have never been self-destructive. We've always fought. We got hit. We weren't always right, but we kept on coming back. Hillary was totally self-delusional, and her cult, it was really a cult group. I'd never seen anything like this.
It was a cult.
It was a cult. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't a liberal movement. It wasn't a movement that had creativity. The closest person to that creativity was the person I happened to have heard a year ago in Warner, New Hampshire. That was Bernie Sanders, who could articulate exactly what the millennials were concerned about. He articulated a formula that made sense. Trump understood that. I understood that. You understood it. I wrote a blog a year ago saying that the normal opponent to Trump would have been Bernie Sanders, not Hillary Clinton. Because Hillary didn't want to hear anything that she didn't want to hear. Alex, you and I understand that we open up and we listen to different things.
Sure.
As you just mentioned, when I talked about devolution of power and it was seemed out of style at 5-6 years ago, I wasn't blowing smoke in the wind. At this time, we don't have to be self-aggrandizing. We simply say the system has changed. We've gone from paper to the internet. The intelligence community had, but what happened was she had seconded guys like Michael Hayden and others who were sycophants. We, in turn, went back to our own people at a lower level and said, look, we've got a problem. She had a civilian coup. Now, you have to understand what that really meant for my own people being military intelligence, civilian intelligence, and all across the board. They understood right away when Hillary and Bill had co-opted Comey, Loretta Lynch, the FBI, the CIA.
She was setting up something really dangerous. She had to be dealt with.
There was no question. And the minute that occurred, and I got a go-ahead, that meant we ran a counter-coup, as you know better than anybody else. We ran it through Julian Assange. And I've got to say, Julian Assange should be honorary citizenship to America. He really has helped us. Snowden is a separate issue. I have to differ with that. Snowden was part of the CIA. He was part of the NSA. Snowden had a top secret clearance and then special access program. It's a very sensitive issue. When you are part of an organization like Daniel Ellsberg and you suddenly become what they call a whistleblower, I'm very, very mistrustful of who you are and who you represent.
You think it might be a double or triple agent?
Snowden doesn't just represent who he is. He doesn't represent the Russians.
You think Trump's right saying go after him?
Yeah, I would say yes.
But Assange is good.
I would bring him through a process that's civil. He should have a defense lawyer, the best that money can buy, Hogan and Hartson or William and Conley. I'm sure there are enough lawyers in the Senate who can recommend that. And he should be tried and see what
But as
happens.
for Assange, he should be given an award.
Thank you.